This is part 2 of our lecture on evolution and natural selection. This time we're going to be talking about the mechanisms of evolution. One thing I want to talk about very briefly here is just a reminder again of the way that we use the term theory in science. I want to remind everybody that when you hear the word theory used in science, you can think of that as meaning the same thing as law. Okay, you can say the theory of gravity or the law of evolution. A theory or a law means that this was a hypothesis that has been tested thousands of times in thousands of different experiments across dozens and dozens of different disciplines, and time and again the findings, the hypothesis was supported to the point that we say, look, it's an extremely strong hypothesis that's been supported thousands and thousands of times. Therefore, it is a theory or a law, just like gravity is. Now, when we talk about the theory of evolution, there's one thing that you can remember. This is a good way to remember it. Evolution is a fact. Okay, we know evolution happens. Every year that people go out and get a flu shot, they're getting a flu shot because the virus from last year has evolved into a new virus that we have to get defenses against. Every antibiotic resistant bacterium has evolved to have that antibiotic resistance. So we know evolution is a fact. Okay, natural selection is the hypothesis. This is the explanation that we believe is most valid for explaining the evolution that has occurred and occurs on a daily basis. Okay, evolution is a fact, natural selection is a hypothesis that explains it. So what is natural selection exactly? Well, natural selection is basically an idea or a series of principles that predict when or if an organism will change into a new species over multiple generations. Okay, it is the mechanism. Natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution occurs. Now, there were two individuals that came up with the idea, the hypothesis of natural selection in the 1850s, and these included Darwin as well as a contemporary of his named Alfred Wallace. And it turned out that Darwin had spent a lot of years after he got back from his trip on the HMS Beagle cultivating his hypotheses, his idea of evolutions and natural selection, and writing up a long book called On the Origin of Species. And he had been taking a very long time to write it. And in the mail one day, he receives a letter from Alfred Wallace, who says to him, you know, I really highly respect you. I'm about ready to submit this paper for publication, and I'd like to get some feedback from you before I submit it to the Royal Society for publication. And to Darwin's chagrin, guess what? The paper that Alfred Wallace had written basically outlined everything that Darwin had been working for 10 years on to describe and explain in his book On the Origin of Species. And so at that point, Darwin and Alfred Wallace got together. They co-authored that paper that was submitted for publication and accepted, and Darwin followed up that co-publication in 1852 with his book On the Origin of Species. And what that really said was that again, we have a mechanism called natural selection, and I'm going to get to the things that are needed for natural selection to occur in a second. We have this mechanism called natural selection that over multiple generations accounts for how a species changes and evolves into another species or gives rise to multiple species. One thing to remember really critical about evolution and natural selection, it is populations of organisms which evolve. An individual cannot evolve because evolution requires multiple generations for adaptations to accumulate and be passed on to offspring. But it does explain how we can have such a large variation within a population like you see in these people in this picture. So, what are the preconditions for natural selection? Natural selection says, first of all, there has to be variation within a population. And I think you can go back and look at that picture on the previous slide there. I was just showing you of all those people watching a football game, and you can look at any crowd at a football game and know that boy, no two people look alike unless they're identical twins. So variation must be present in a population. That's number one. The second thing is traits among those individuals must be heritable. That means that you have to be able to pass on, say, your longer legs, or be able to pass on the color of your skin, or whatever it might be. If you're a moth, like you see in this picture here, you better be able to pass on how well you fly, or whatever it might be. The third thing is that you have to produce more organisms, more individuals in a population than can survive. Okay, so if you produce more offspring than there is food and shelter to support, then there's going to arise from that competition for the limited resources available. And what that's going to do is make that variation that is present become valuable. Because if two organisms in a population vary in their wingspan, it may be that the individual with longer wingspan perhaps is better able to acquire food and is going to be more successful in surviving. So that's number 3. You've got to have more individuals alive or produced than can survive, and that sets up competition. And lastly, some of those traits obviously have to be advantageous. Okay, maybe having the longer wingspan, for example, is advantageous, or being a faster flyer, or having shorter antennae, or having longer legs, or whatever it might be. Those allow for those individuals that have the advantageous trait to be more likely to survive to reproductive age, to have offspring, and to therefore pass that particular beneficial adaptation on to their offspring. Now, if you look here at this picture down here, this is a picture of pepper moths, and you can see variation in a population and how that can be effective. These two individuals in the left-hand picture here, one moth is right here, the other is here. You can clearly see the moth that has dark blackish colored wings, but it's very difficult on this light colored tree bark to see the individual that has sort of a salt and pepper appearance to its wings. On this particular tree, the individual that has the salt and pepper appearance has a selective advantage. Okay, its adaptation of coloration is advantageous for it hiding from predators like birds. The bird is more likely to see the moth with the dark wings. Conversely, if these two moths land on a dark rock or on a darker tree bark, you can see now that the individual with black wings is better hidden, and the individual with the salt and pepper appearance to its wings stands out quite readily against the dark background, and in this case would be at a disadvantage for hiding from predators. So that variation, depending on the environment, may or may not be advantageous. An adaptation that's advantageous in one environment may not be advantageous in another, and that's a critical point to remember. Now, what are the outcomes of these 4 preconditions of natural selection? Well, if you have these traits, if they're heritable, if you make more organisms in a population than can survive, and if these traits you can pass them on and they can be beneficial in some settings, then over time, beneficial traits will appear in greater frequency in a population, okay, over multiple generations. If we go back to our example of the moths, if all of the trees were black in a particular region, then over time it would become more and more common to see the black-winged moths, and less likely that you would come across the salt and pepper coloration of moths. Okay, so more individuals with the advantageous trait will appear over multiple generations, and as a result the population becomes well adapted to that local environment. Now, if the environment changes, then those adaptations that were advantageous may no longer be advantageous. They may become disadvantageous. I'm going to remind you all again that it's populations that do evolving. Individuals do not evolve. Okay? Evolving means passing accumulated advantageous traits on to the next generation. And again, as I mentioned before, perhaps the best real-time example of evolution that we know of today is the rise in antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And here's just one example from the Centers for of Disease Control in the United States, Centers for Disease Control. And they're tracking MRSA, which you may have heard of before, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It's a type of bacterium that can cause very serious and sometimes fatal infections, particularly in people who are already sick, meaning that their immune system is already compromised. And what we can see here is tracking the number of patients in in some intensive care units between 1989 and 2003, and seeing how many of those bacterial infections are resistant to oxacillin, which is another type of antibiotic. You can see that over time they went from about 30% of patients in intensive care units had bacteria resistant to oxacillin to, by 2003, having more than 60% of those patients infected with bacteria that were resistant to oxacillin. That is a real-time example in a matter of just a dozen or so years of an organism, or well, about 20 years, I guess, of a type of bacterium evolving to be resistant to a commonly used antibiotic. All right, that's the end of our second part of the talk. We'll be moving on to artificial selection and evidence for evolution in part 3.